You're watching The Elevator Show with Eden Wall.
Hey! It's good to see you.
Nice to see you, man. How are you?
All right, man. Come on over here. We've got a little bit of time to talk. I have to tell you something. Can I tell you something?
You make a confession.
It's so great to see you. I'm not sure when the last time we saw each other was. I mean, years.
Years
for
ago,
sure, for
yeah.
sure.
And
Interesting fact that Aaron and I started our careers together. We cut our teeth on Rogers Television. When was the year? I don't even know the
I'm
year.
not admitting to that. I just
Yeah.
know we were two pishers and now we're two putzes. That's all I know, really.
Hey, man. You know what they say, speak for yourself.
Done.
It's tremendous to see you today.
Great to see
and we're
you.
going to talk about something that I've always wanted to talk about, but there just wasn't the opportunity or the situation wasn't right. And I feel that you are the right person, the right expert to speak about intergenerational trauma, which is something I think you'll agree is not spoken about enough in the Jewish world. And it should be, because I feel like we are all in some way feeling the impact of intergenerational trauma.
Absolutely.
Do you, for those that don't know, Aaron, let's give them kind of like a working definition of
Sure.
what is intergenerational trauma.
Intergenerational trauma is the transmission of traumatic effects from the receiver to their offspring. It could be rooted in a historic event such as the Holocaust,
Right.
or family relations. And right now, we're starting to see the rise in research with respect to epigenetic inheritance, which proposes that the receiver of trauma passes it on genetically and biologically to their offspring. So this is a very new concept that I think is important for Holocaust survivors, survivors of any type of genocide or war environment to be mindful of, because far too often we tend to blame ourselves for our trauma or our anxiety, and we need to understand it's not a choice.
There are those out there that are going to play the devil's advocate with us here. They're going to say, well, now you have another excuse to blame somebody else for your plight in life. And I want to make it clear that's not what we're here to do. We're here to talk about something that is becoming very scientific, as you mentioned, biologically proven. Now this is a game changer.
We need to remove ourselves from these ideas of tribalism, and we need to look at it in the totality. Whether you're Jewish, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Buddhist, whether you're Hindu, Christian, or Catholic, unfortunately, history is littered with events of war, and people have been on the wrong side of socio-political conditions. So this isn't exclusively a Jewish issue. This is an issue that affects all of humanity, and it's not about making excuses. It's about having an increased understanding of self and of how we are impacted by certain events.
And you want to speak about that as it relates to the Holocaust? Because your mother, correct me if I'm wrong, but your mother was a Holocaust survivor.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of impact, there's a range. So it can manifest in terms of domestic violence, substance abuse, but on the other end of the spectrum is low self-esteem, low self-worth. So it really depends on the individual. There's a wide range, but what we can see is, for instance, generally, the Jackie Mason, that kind of shtick, or Richard Lewis, where they were anxious. People would laugh at that, but if you deconstruct it a little bit further, that's actually anxiety. And that's probably intergenerational trauma.
It's actually quite tragic the way trauma is passed down and the way trauma perpetuates itself. And I know you didn't want to speak too much personally about that, but how do you think this is overcome?
In terms of specific treatments, there are a variety of them, but two in particular are cognitive behavioral therapy, where in essence you become your own therapist with coping mechanisms. And another one I think people will be able to relate to conceptually is narrative therapy. So basically, it's disrupting that internal dialogue. So if you have depression and anxiety, you may start feeding yourself these ideas that I'm a loser. And with narrative therapy, what it does is it reorients the mind, and you start saying, my sickness or my ailment or my disease is making me think I'm a loser.
Right, and I have this feeling that much of our anxiety, whether we know it or not, is stemming from that intergenerational trauma. So what can we say to people to encourage them to try to deal with this?
Well, I think
people who are watching now.
I think it's very important to, first of all, understand that this wasn't a choice. This is more a disease and an ailment. So we need to not persecute ourselves for what we're experiencing, and to go out and get help. You and I grew up in a generation where, toxic masculinity is a popular term, but I think it's applicable to our generation in terms of medication or seeking treatment. You were somehow seen as less than or weak or not as masculine. And I think we need to absolve ourselves from those philosophical chains and understand that we're all human. And I suspect that the pandemic potentially helped us along that journey, because no one, I would argue no one, is as mentally fit now as they were prior to the pandemic. So perhaps this has given us a collective opportunity to walk in those shoes.
Yeah, and I wanted to point out something to you, that trauma itself is a relative term.
It is.
Right? We can be traumatized by something that seems relatively innocuous
To someone else.
to somebody else. And so it's fair to say that we are always experiencing some form of trauma throughout our life. Do you think there's such a thing as good trauma? Or is that only trauma that you've processed through and healed yourself from?
Yes, the latter. I think you can turn a traumatic event into a good situation. It could serve as the fuel to want to create change for yourself and for other people. But I think one thing that you and I have discussed is we have to overcome these barriers. So the question is, why are there barriers to addressing this issue? And one, some people could look at it as a trigger. Some people don't want to see themselves as a victim, and you have survivor shame. So those are some of the obstacles that are impeding the healing process for the community. Having trauma doesn't make you weak. I would argue not addressing it doesn't make you strong.
It is unbelievable to see you. It brings back fond memories of where we started. I just couldn't be happier for the direction you are on with your teaching in the academic world, with this comic book. It's just incredible, and I wish you continued health, happiness on your journey, and thanks for coming on.
I'm very privileged.
The Elevator Show, man. Great
Thank you,
to
brother.
see you.
You've been watching The Elevator Show with Eden Wall. See you next time.